Welcome. You are listening to Haunted Histories on Paranormal UK Radio. And hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us for this issue of Haunted Histories on Paranormal UK Radio. Now, before I get going, some of you may have noticed me sharing that the Higgy Pop Awards are up again, and it would be absolutely awesome if you could nominate Haunted Histories as a good podcast. Haunted Histories, obviously, here on Paranormal UK Radio. But tonight's guest is someone who... I've spent a couple of nights in a prison with him when he was researching for his book, The Hanging Pit of Bodmin Jail. We've had many a long conversation. In fact, we've been talking for the last sort of 80 minutes before we started recording this about pretty much everything as a bit of a catch up. But what I do want to say is, hi, Richard Estep. It's Clem Fandango. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you, Pen Fandango.
I was hoping that would make you smile, that intro.
I am smiling.
Just to prove I did really watch Toast of London.
The greatest show.
It was actually, yes. I never saw it when it was out originally, and I don't know why, but I binged watched it. My husband and I both binged watched it on Netflix, and I can honestly say Matt Berry is a genius.
He is.
But then again, you have your own personal Clem, don't you, in your family?
I do. He is adorable. Absolutely adorable. He's a fluffy werewolf cat.
Yes, one of your 3 black cats?
One of my 3, and the only one with more hair coming out of his ears than I do.
And who's the Meeper?
That's Clem, the Grim Meeper.
That is Clem, yes. Mm-hmm. Anyone who follows Richard on social media may see the occasional Meep videos, and you just have to watch and listen for the meep to have your heart absolutely melt with the sound of Clem Fandango. And if you don't know who Clem Fandango actually is, go and watch Toast of London. You won't be disappointed. Now, Mr. Estep, what have you been up to, good sir?
It's been a year, hasn't it? When did we last talk?
Oh, gosh. What
was the last show we did? It wasn't Fox Hollow, was it?
Could have been. I can't remember. I don't even know. We're still in 2020, aren't we? Feels like
we'll be in 2020 for the next 117 years.
I think it will be. Yeah. I'm hoping 116 for good behaviour.
Don't be optimistic.
Okay. I think it possibly was Fox Hollow. You know,
it might well have been. So it's been a while. I don't know if we've done a show this year or not, but
no, we haven't done one this year. I know we haven't done one this year because we haven't. We haven't done one this year. I'm sure of it. So it's been over a year.
A lot of water under the bridge, a lot of new cases, a lot of books, a lot of TV stuff. Yeah, it's been a year for sure, and the whole COVID thing, of course.
Well, that little thing that's still going, and obviously you work in the medical biz, don't you? So you've been thrown into it.
Yeah, we're definitely keeping busy with COVID-19. Boy, are we.
The part of the world you live in's had quite a few things going. Didn't you have some fires or something in... Or something?
We had massive wildfires, which is still... I mean, they're still a thing. We still have orange blood moons at sunset right now. It makes for a beautiful moon until it reminds you why it is the way that it is.
Yeah, no, it's been a very, I don't know if the right word, tumultuous year.
I think it applies, definitely. Yeah. It's been one hell of a year. I'm ready to be done with it, honestly. Yeah.
Tell me about it. But you've had a few books out there. I've lost count how many books, because you are possibly one of the most prolific writers that I have the pleasure and honour of knowing. I mean, I'm chuffed if I get one out a year, and you're doing 3 or 4 in a year, which I can't keep up with reading them. That's the main problem. But I know 2 of the ones you've had out this year. Did Gacy's Ghost come out this year as well?
It did. It came out this summer.
It was it really that reason? Because I read that one recently as well, and that was an interesting one. And obviously, you had one of our mutual friends, the lovely Mr. Wes Coleman, was one of your investigators on that. And another one you've released this year, which is one I've been waiting for with bated breath, and I've got it sitting there. For the sake of honesty, I haven't read it yet because I've been reading up on stuff for shows and things. But Villisca came out this year. How is it?
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
How's it doing? How's the book doing?
It's doing pretty well. It's October, isn't it now? So as you'll know, paranormal books, ghost stories tend to do well in October anyway. Yeah. So it's doing pretty well in the Amazon charts from what I can see. And it was, I only finished living that story in August. I have a very bizarre way of writing. So I always have several different ones on the go, and sometimes Bodmin took me 2 years to write. But because I have this scattershot approach of bouncing from one manuscript to another, and then I'll go do more research, and then I'll go revisit the location because I forgot something or just have a hankering to do it, you know.
Yeah.
And so I actually wrote the last chunk of the Villisca book in the Axe Murder house. Yeah. And for the first time, I slept there in one of the bedrooms in which the children were all murdered. And I'd wanted to evoke for the reader what it felt like to spend a night in that house and to be vulnerable and to sleep there. Yeah. So yeah, Villisca was I don't want to call it a fun project. That's the wrong word. Yeah. But it was certainly a fulfilling one to do. Yeah. And I'll be perfectly happy if I never set foot in that house again.
Really? I mean, it's one of the ones I've been waiting for a while because it's like you say, you can't say it's fun to read about it, fun to, you know, and I've researched it for stuff, but there is something about it that just draws you in and you just have to know more. You kind of, so that's one I've genuinely been looking forward to. And as I say, it's on my bookshelf to read. Another one, I know the foreword was written by this incredibly talented English writer who has a tendency to squat in doorways. The Hanging Pit.
Oh, yeah. You're talking about Jeff Snott, the well-known doorway squatter from Aberdeen.
Yes, me. I was honoured to write the foreword for The Hanging Pit. That was.
Did you? Did you write the foreword to one? How have I forgotten that?
You cheeky monkey. You know I did. Yes, and that came out this year as well to a hell of a lot of publicity and people, because Bodmin has just reopened as well, hasn't it?
Yeah, talk about timing. I mean, so the last time I was at Bodmin, which was with you, they'd started this renovation and were turning the old naval wing. The only way they could save the building financially was to turn it into a going concern. So they'd started renovating the old the naval wing and the Gen Pop, I think it was, to become a paranormal kind of experience center and hotel. And so it's opening to great fanfare right now. Now that hotels are allowed to open. Yeah. And they are selling the book at the jail, which I rather like. Yeah. I kind of like the idea of, I hope they stick a copy in each room. You know, I love the idea that because I write a lot of my books actually at the location at the time, I hope that that people will enjoy reading them there. I was just at one of my favorite haunts this weekend, Malvern Manor, and I hid 3 signed first editions of my book about Malvern Manor in the building.
I thought it was a brilliant idea.
I just kind of like the idea that it will reward the nosy investigator or visitor that's poking around and starts if you're going to be super thorough.
I know this is going to sound really sexist, but you know it's going to be women that find them, don't you?
You think so?
Yeah.
We'll see. We'll see when they turn up. And I'm due to go back before the end of the year, so I will probably hide a few more. But it's just
I might actually, the one I'm currently writing, I might have to do that at that location, actually thinking about it, because I think I might have to borrow your idea.
Yeah, but I mean, where do you hide a book in a spearmint rhino? That's That's the problem, isn't it?
Where nobody looks, so at eye level.
Oh, yeah, that's fair.
Yeah.
Sorry if I just gave away your next book.
You cheek. It's a good job I don't take offence at you, isn't it? Talking about...
You know me better by now.
No, I'm writing about the old school in Hitchin, the old British school in Hitchin. So, I might have to borrow your idea, and don't worry, I'll give you credit for it. But yeah, so you got the Bodmin one out, and I know that. I know the lovely Kirsten was so excited about that book coming out, and I know she's
been reading it to the ghosts, which I love. She told me that she takes the book in at night when she's on her own, and will read excerpts. So I can only imagine what kind of Amazon reviews they'll leave.
Well, I know she told me she reads it to her snakes, but I didn't know she read it to the spirits of the prison as well. So
I kind of like the idea, because the whole point was to try and tell their story, and you and I talked at length about tragedies like Selina Wadge, who was hanged at Bodmin after murdering her own child.
Yeah.
And you do kind of wonder what they would make of that story.
You do. And I do think, I personally think Selina should never have been hanged for what she did, but it would be interesting. I know that one of the lovely investigators who helped us with it, the lovely Gaynor, she sort of said to me, now it's reopened, do you want to see if we'll go back and we'll have a visit with Kirsten at some point. So, I'm sure Kirsten will let us explore after dark. I think Leslie might come with us as well, the lovely Leslie, and we'll see if any...
All-female investigation.
Well, yeah. Hell yeah. Because obviously Gaynor worked with me on my last book. She was one of my investigators with me on the last book, and it's a great help. So, it's going to be interesting to see how it's but, if you want, I'll hide a couple of your books around there if you want.
I actually would love that. I just kind of... one of the locations that we're going to talk about today, the Fairfield Inn, they have a copy of my book about the place in each room. And so I just kind of like the idea of learning about the story of a location while you're in the location.
Yeah. Yeah. No, you and I are very similar in that respect. One of the things, I don't know, when you're looking, do you look up the history of the location before you go, or do you wait until after you've come home to sort of to do your location sort of research?
I do see the logic that some investigators have of, I'll go in blind and then not know anything, and then that way I won't be influenced. I think there's great merit to that approach. But if I'm working with any sensitives, I like them to not know anything.
Yeah.
But when you are trying to tell the story and frame it as a narrative, I think it behooves you to do that research in advance.
Yeah.
Personally,
specific names of people that might have been there at the beginning, or more. Obviously you get the names like I think it's Jeb Stewart is one of the famous ones. Jeb Lee is one of the famous ones associated with Gettysburg. So you didn't even really need to research much to know those, because they're common ones. But some of the ones we're going to talk about, things like Amos and people like that, would you have looked up those names before?
Gettysburg's not normal, because I'm a Gettysburg nerd. Like, long before the ghost fascination with the place, I've always been fascinated with the American Civil War in general, but specifically Gettysburg. So I know more about that battle than I do any other battle of the Civil War, because I've studied it so intensely, just out of my own personal interest.
Yeah.
But if I was going to someday, I'd like to go to Antietam or Cold Harbor or any of those other Civil War battle sites. I did Chickamauga. That's a good one. And I did not look up any information there. I just actually wanted to roam the field.
Yeah.
And had a very cool moment there, because I found a grave. I'm sorry, not a grave. It was a memorial marker from an artillery battery commanded by a man called Harry Estep. And, which I thought was kind of cool. And turns out I have a nephew by that same name.
Wow.
So I was just a little,
Your surname can't be that common, is it?
Estep is surprisingly common here in the States, yeah. Yeah, in the UK, not very common at all.
All right. Because is it French originally? Is it?
No, it's Spanish, actually.
Oh, Okay.
my understanding. But my grandfather was American, which is where that's how an Estep came to be in Leicester, an Estep family.
Oh, I see. Okay. Now, I think I know that when you find something with your surname on it, it does sort of make it feel real, doesn't it? I mean, my mum's maiden name is Danby, which is not a common surname. And her and my dad were up on, I think they were in Yorkshire somewhere, and they found a place called Danby Castle. And we've found out there is a familial link. And unfortunately, it's a ruins and it is owned by someone, unfortunately. Otherwise, I'd say, it's mine. I'm coming in. But
another doorway for you to squat in, Penny.
Another doorway for me, albeit a slightly fallen down doorway. I might have to do it with a hard hat on just in case. But yes, always looking for a doorway. And if you don't know the joke about me squatting in doorways, just have a look at the cover of my first book, My Haunted History, and you'll get the joke. But now, yeah. Although I did see the best squat ever with you, Mr. Estep, when I think you were in the back of the ambulance cleaning, squatting.
Oh yeah, that was the don't kneel in COVID squat. That wasn't a Penny tribute. That was we're deconning and I don't want to get infected with coronavirus squat right there.
You see, normally the reason I squat in doorways is the floor's wet and I don't want to get a wet bum.
It's not because you're trying to make your book cover look like an 80s album cover then.
Oh, that too. Wanna be rock star, me. So Gettysburg, I mean, for a Brit, it could be seen as unusual that it's an American battle that you're, as you put it, a geek about. Why Gettysburg? What is it about the Gettysburg battle that has you so intrigued by it?
I totally agree with you. I have no idea either. I mean, I've always been a military history buff, and so I've a good. I think it's fair to say in-depth knowledge of World War II, World War One, the American Civil War. Not nearly as much about the English Civil War as I would like. I should remedy that in future. But why Gettysburg? I think it's because I visited once. I visited right after September 11 in 2001. Mm-hmm. I was taking a class in Washington, and so I decided to go visit. And there's just something about the place that grabs you and captures you and doesn't let you go. And I don't mean it in a sinister way, but you often will hear Gettysburg referred to as hallowed ground for Americans, and I couldn't agree more. It feels different. There's a feeling you get at Gettysburg that great events took place there and still resonate to this day. Right.
I mean, I can kind of get that because even as a kid, I'd heard of Gettysburg, but I didn't know it was a place. I thought it was battle. It was as a young kid. I mean, like 7, 8 years old. So when I found out it was actually a town in its own right, as I got a bit older, I was quite surprised because I thought it was just a battle. And then obviously as you get older, you learn about things like the Gettysburg Address and Civil War, American Civil War, and all those kind of things. But I was just intrigued as to what triggered that. I mean, I have obviously read your books on it. The one on, is it the Fairfield Haunting? And I can't even speak now. It's really good for a podcast host, isn't it? Farnsworth House. And I know you talk about the fact that your first visit there, it was when you were still in computing. In IT, wasn't it, or something? And yeah. And you'd visited there, and you wanted to go, but you must have had an interest in it before to visit, or was it just almost sort of a sort of an inquiry as to everyone goes on about this, I might as well visit it?
I think a lot of it stems from the movie. I loved Ron Maxwell's movie, which was a TV movie / it was shot as a movie and then was long enough that they released it as a miniseries. And I thought it was so well done, with the exception of the fake beards and wigs. I think that is what made me want to go see for myself, because Gettysburg is an American tragedy in so many ways. And it's also kind of the high watermark of the Confederacy, right? This is, before Gettysburg, everything was still on the table to play for. U.S. history would have completely changed if Lee had made some different decisions. I would go out on a limb and say that things would have been vastly different if Stonewall Jackson had not been killed by his own men just a few months before the battle. So there's that sense of it being a pivot point, and the American Civil War and all of U.S. history, if not Western world history, would have been different if it weren't for what happened on this relatively small stretch of land.
Yeah.
Because Gettysburg has no importance whatsoever other than the battle. It's a confluence, it's a crossroads. So a confluence of roads come together there. But if the battle had not happened, you would never have heard of that town.
Yeah. Yeah. But don't you think that could be said for a lot of battles? Like, I mean, we were talking about World War II before we came on air.
Mm-hmm.
If say Hitler hadn't made the decision to postpone Operation Barbarossa until the winter, or had decided not to try and attack Russia, and especially as his generals were saying that you can't, you're going to be spreading yourself too thin.
Yeah.
How things might have differed just one by one decision.
Well, you're completely right, but that you can't localize that to one place.
Right.
Gettysburg,
yeah.
Gettysburg has a character of its own. It has a personality of its own. I mean, one of the joys of wandering the streets of Gettysburg is the fact that there are still cannonballs embedded in the walls of houses and barns.
Yeah.
How cool is that? The Farnsworth House, which we'll talk about as we go along, I mean, there are something like 200 impact strikes on the wall from Union small arms fire.
Yeah.
So the people of Gettysburg live with this every day.
Yeah.
And you wander the streets, you often see reenactors, you often see people wearing the blue and the gray. And I always wonder, there was one chap, I went up to him and spoke to him, and I just was resisting the urge to just gently poke him with my finger to make sure he was real. And it really is like stepping back into the past when you're at Gettysburg. There are no tall buildings. There are very few signs of modernity there. The battlefield, with the exception of one eyesore McDonald's, which they should never have been allowed to build so close, walking the battlefield itself, you are completely unimpeded by modern history, by modern, the everyday 21st century world.
Yeah. So the battlefield at Gettysburg, is it still the same as it would have been 150 odd years, 60 years ago?
It's as close as you can reasonably expect. I mean, one of the pivotal sub-battles was the Battle of Little Round Top, which is at the south end of the field. It was the Union left flank and was very heavily contested on day 2 of the 3-day battle. Now, they actually put a road in about a century ago so that people could come on up the back of Little Round Top. And they actually ran trams with tourists into the area. So not that long after the battle, the field was changed in the name of tourism. But they are gradually restoring things as much as they can. I mean, the peach orchard, which is an infamous bloodbath, they're starting to plant trees and they're going to keep them at the appropriate height. The sight lines are all the same. You can stand on Little Round Top and look across to Devil's Den and see what it must have been like, to trade small arms fire with the Confederates that were located in Devil's Den.
Yeah.
And there is a creek that runs through between Little Round Top in a valley and Devil's Den, and it ran literally red with blood. Plum Run. It ran red with blood on the day of the battle because there were so many dead and dying. So it takes very little imagination to put yourself there in that day. And I actually ran up. I say ran. I'm 47 years of age, and I am in shape, but that shape is a sack of potatoes.
Yeah, but you've lost a lot of weight recently. I have seen the photos.
That's true. But I wanted to run up Little Round Top and not use the road just to feel what it must have been like for the Texans that did it on day 2.
Yeah.
And those guys were wearing wool coats on a July day, and they were carrying packs, and they'd marched all day and were fed straight into the fight. So there's no substitute for truly walking the ground yourself.
It's interesting you say that, because when we took the family to Normandy, to the D-Day beaches a couple of years ago, we got my eldest, who would have been then about 9, I think, to run from the sea to up the beaches and say, right, now you're doing that with all your gear on that's soaking wet, you're carrying a machine gun fire at you, you've got people dropping dead either side of you. And, even at 9, he was like, whoa. Wow. And I think by doing, I mean, that was when it's all been commercialized, but it does give you a kind of an idea as to how it would have felt.
And it's interesting that, you know, history books, as you and I, we share a love of history and history books, but there is no substitute for having that academic knowledge and then actually walking the ground.
Yeah.
Gettysburg ended with the so-called Pickets Charge on day 3, where the Confederates marched right into the teeth of the Union cannon and in the middle of the Union lines. It was Lee's last desperate gamble to break the Union line, and it failed, but 6,000 casualties out of the almost 18,000 men that took part. And you can't, because they have cannon there on the field right now in the positions they would have been at, you walk towards those cannon, and my friend Jason and I did this, and I took Wes there also, and you imagine what it's like. You see those black muzzles getting closer and closer, and you imagine them spitting cannonballs at you at first, and then canister, which is essentially shotgun fire. And, you know, what must that have been like? It's amazing. It's just, it really adds a dimension to your appreciation of what those men went through.
Yeah. And a lot of these men, correct me if I'm wrong, they weren't career soldiers.
The vast majority of them were not career soldiers. Many of the officers were, but these were men that took up the cause of Union or Confederacy because of either A, where they happened to be born, or B, because of a decision they made. I mean, Robert E. Lee himself had been offered overall command of the Union Army, and turned it down because he said he could not raise his sword against his native Virginia.
Yeah.
You know, so I think hard choices were made by many of these men, but so many enlisted, and it was the whole "it'll all be over by Christmas" line of crap that we hear so many times with wars. Yeah. Nobody anticipated the meat grinder that this would become.
Yeah. And the other thing about the Civil War that I know some people say it's this fact is sort of thrown out all the time, but I still think it's a very important one. Isn't it the only war that we know of that it's been brother against brother?
Well, that's every Civil War.
Well, right, but it's the biggest one that it's the main one that people talk about. That there are a lot of tales of one brother being Union, the brother being Confederate, and them having to shoot at each other.
Yeah, I mean, that occurred in the English Civil War also, but never on the scale of the American Civil War. And that adds to the tragedy, right? Because everybody that died was American. Gettysburg, you had 58,000 casualties. Now, casualties include wounded. That's not killed. But still, you had to put that in perspective. You had an entire Vietnam's worth of casualties in one 4-day stretch.
Yeah.
It's just unbelievable.
Yeah.
And the things that you learn, the screaming of the men at night was so bad. The screaming of the wounded laying in the fields that weren't recovered was so loud. They brought out the brass bands, the regimental bands were brought out at night to play to try and drown it out. You know, I mean, we can't even imagine what that must have been like.
I mean, you mentioned about the injured. Now, when we're saying casualties, we're not talking about those that died on the battlefield, but how many of those? I mean, you're a medical man. How many of those probably died 2-3 days, week after from septicemia, from failed, I say operations, you can't see I'm inverting commas here, but failed, speech marks, failed operations, amputations, everything else. I mean, the reason I'm mentioning that is obviously the places we're talking about, a lot of them were makeshift hospitals. Pretty much, the research I've been doing on it this week, and you'll be able to add to this, Richard, nearly everywhere that had a floor seemed to become a makeshift hospital of some sort.
And when we talk hospitals, what we really mean is place for amputation primarily. Surgery back then was really about cutting off the limb and hoping that you survived.
Would they cauterize it with a hot sort of iron, that kind of thing? Is that what they would have done?
Cauterization in some cases. Tourniquets were employed quite often.
Yeah.
When you leave a tourniquet on for an extended period of time, if you're not careful, you get a lot of lactic acid buildup. And once that returns to the general circulation, when you release the tourniquet, then you start to see acidosis and cardiac dysrhythmias and all kinds of other issues. But
what's acidosis, Richard?
So your body has we all live within a fairly delicate pH balance of acidosis and alkalosis, and it changes throughout the day. Like I'm drinking a Coke right now. Well, that's carbonated. Carbonic acid is an acid. It's making my pH more acidic. Yeah. Generally speaking, your kidneys and your respirations filter that stuff out.
Right.
You know, but in the sense of cases in which acid builds up in the body fairly quickly and intensely, that can cause some real medical issues.
I see. Okay.
But at Gettysburg, there are many accounts of bodies being discovered so long afterwards because the wounded crawled off into the woods to die, or to get away from the fighting, and were never discovered. Devil's Den, the patch of rocks, the rock formation that is so often talked about at the south end of the field, they had decomposing, primarily Confederate bodies there for weeks, if not months, because the victors take care of their own first. So the Union dead were treated better than the Confederate dead, and many of them were just left to rot. Yeah.
But in the hospitals, be they the makeshift ones or not, was there, I mean, one of the things when I've read about, say, World War One, you've found that although the soldiers, opposition soldiers, weren't happy that, say, I'm talking about, say, the British, the Allies side, they weren't happy that a German soldier might be brought in to treat, a lot of medical staff treated them just the same, because as far as they were concerned, they were still just a soldier, they were injured, they needed care.
Yeah.
Did a similar thing happen with the Confederates and the Union, or did you find Confederate hospitals and Union hospitals and never the twain shall meet, so to speak?
No, there was generally speaking a sort of gentleman's agreement, if you will, that a patient was a patient, at least where possible, And the truth is that this is a war. When you go to war, you do your best to dehumanize, depersonalize the enemy, right? That's an old tactic. If you're going to train your soldiers to kill somebody, you don't want to think of them as similar to you. You want them to be different.
Yeah.
And propaganda, as I'm sure you know, Penny, is the entire art of that, right? It's the art of. It's why in the Second World War they depersonalized the Japanese on propaganda posters to look like monkeys and apes.
Yeah.
And of course the Germans did the same thing, and it's been done throughout history.
Everyone does. Yeah.
But when the person you're fighting looks like you, talks with a similar accent to you, has a family just like you, it's really difficult to depersonalize someone that could be your neighbor.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to look at Farnsworth first, because that one really spoke to me. And I did actually have a look to see if I could find, because there's a couple of hauntings that are meant to take place at Farnsworth, one of which being a little boy called Jeremy, who's meant to have been sadly killed outside by a horse and carriage type thing. Now, I did myself try and find any evidence of that having happened. I couldn't.
Nor could I.
No, the tools I've got at my disposal, there might be something, but I went back as far as 1810 and couldn't find anything. So, it's perfectly plausible. I found a lot of accounts of children I did actually find an account of a young girl being run over by a horse and carriage, but that was about 100 miles away. So, so it definitely would have happened. It's plausible, but I couldn't find any trace of it. Also, you've got the nurse, I think it is Mary, is it, who's meant to sort of frequent the place? But I think one of the most powerful stories from Farnsworth is that it's there that wasn't it the Kling brothers said that the shooting of Jenny Wade took place.
Yeah, and if I may, let me give a big shout out to Brad and Barry Kling, because Brad, number one, wrote the foreword to both of my Gettysburg books, and his enthusiasm and support. I honestly think the books would not have happened without Brad and Barry, so I owe them a huge debt.
Shout away, my man! Shout away!
Yeah, so I appreciate that. And Brad, in fact, they're in Gettysburg this weekend, doing a public event. So Brad's so passionate about Gettysburg, and it was that passion that he and I were talking about this at a convention, and that led directly to me writing the Fairfield book.
Yeah. So you're a Gettysburg geek. I would say Brad's a geek with a capital G.
Well, he captured, if you haven't seen it, it's incredible. He captured footage of what he believes is a Phantom Union regiment when he was a teenager.
Yeah. And
that started them on their whole paranormal odyssey, you know. It was shown on their show, Ghost Lab, and I believe you can find it on the web also. Ghost Lab being one of my favorite paranormal shows. But Brad has always been fascinated to the point of almost obsession with Gettysburg itself. So when he and I got together, I'm sure we bored Barry to death. But Jenny Wade, is the only civilian killed during the Battle of Gettysburg. She was baking bread to help give to wounded soldiers in her kitchen. Most of the people of the town were in their cellars, hiding rather sensibly in their cellars for 3 or 4 days, waiting for this nightmare to pass, because Armageddon just descended on this small town.
I think what we need to interject there as well, is that these fights aren't just taking place in a big field.
No, that's a good point. I mean,
street battles.
They began on the outskirts of Gettysburg, and perhaps it would be useful if we do just a quick précis of Gettysburg, Penny. But initially, it was essentially a meeting engagement. You know, the Army of Northern Virginia and the Army of the Potomac, they'd been dancing around each other for a while. Lee was jockeying, who commanded the Confederates, had been jockeying for position, was hoping to position himself between the Union soldiers and Washington to cut off their lines of supply and communication. Mm-hmm. You can't strategically have a big enemy army at your back and feel secure. Mm-hmm. So when finally what happened was that as they approached Gettysburg, of all things, the fight was about shoes. Was that the Confederate commanders had heard that there was a supply of shoes in Gettysburg, and some of their men were marching in bare feet. Their feet were just torn up.
Yeah. They
did not have the logistical advantages that the Union had. And so they were given permission to go into Gettysburg and find shoes, but under no circumstances should they bring about a general engagement.
Yeah.
Right? Lee did not want to get sucked into a battle. He said if there are any Union troops there, if it's a small number, brush them aside, sweep them away, but do not get sucked in, which is exactly what happened. Yeah. Turns out that Union cavalry were already in the area under the command of General John Buford. And Buford saw that the ground at Gettysburg was perfect for a defensive battle. Mm-hmm. Perfect. But cavalrymen don't do well against infantry brigades supported by artillery. Mm. They're not intended to slug it out. They're supposed to be fleet and nimble.
Yeah.
The Confederates cavalry was supposed to be screening their army, but their commander, Jeb Stuart, was something of an egomaniac, and he was off trying to get his name in the newspapers and not doing his job. He was not screening the Confederate army.
Yes.
So Buford sent word to General John Reynolds, who was bringing up an infantry corps behind him, and said, listen, I think we can hold them at Gettysburg. If you can get up here with some infantry support, we can give these guys a bloody nose. Mm-hmm. And so the first day of the battle, the first engagement, was essentially Union cavalry to the north and west of the town. They set up along a series of ridge lines. Ridge lines make great defensive positions.
Yeah.
And in groups of 4 cavalrymen, one guy would hold 4 horses while the other 3 shot. Mm-hmm. And they just continued to defend against the Confederates. The Confederates got their blood up. They sent in more and more infantrymen. And like a spring kind of collapsing, the Union troops fell back on Gettysburg. Mm-hmm. Until finally they held the Confederates long enough for the Union infantry to come up.
Right.
And that's when Lee realizes, well, the following morning anyway, that he has now been sucked into a major battle, because the Confederates pushed the Union all the way through Gettysburg. There's fighting in the streets of the town, and it's brutal fighting too. It gets hand to hand. Mm. It's a very bloody business. There are bayonets involved in everything. And so the Union are pushed through the town. They retreat to a place called Cemetery Hill, which is a fantastic defensive position, and they start consolidating their forces. And before you know it, the town itself and all of the fields and creeks surrounding it have become this battlefield. And that's how we really kick off the Gettysburg campaign.
it's hard to picture there not being energy remaining with that level of adrenaline and testosterone. I hate to say it, but just pure and utter fear and not knowing what was going to be round the corner and not knowing whether friend or foe was going to appear. And, you know, at least in a bit of a field, or even if you were in the trenches in, say, World War One, you knew exactly where you were fighting. But when it gets to street warfare, unless you know, it's like that's where you get the benefit of like the eye in the sky in modern day stuff, or even a heat-seeking sort of camera type. You know, you can see there's someone waiting around the corner. You just wouldn't have known what was coming.
No, that's very true. Urban combat is always very manpower intensive.
Yeah.
Even today, the British Army calls it fibula, fighting in built-up areas. And soldiers that train for it are under no illusions. I mean, you look at what happened in Fallujah when, you know, which I think, at least as far as I'm aware, was the last big, huge-scale kind of hand-to-hand urban combat. And it's a very bloody affair, very violent. And so you have a lot of soldiers that pay for that with their lives.
Yeah.
And to me, it's kind of surprising. If it weren't for the sellers, more civilians would have been killed.
Yeah.
If they hadn't hunkered down and waited for the storm to pass above them.
But isn't it Jenny? I mean, that wasn't actually her wasn't she Virginia Wade?
Virginia Wade.
Not the Virginia Wade, a different Virginia Wade, obviously. But
right.
But she'd come to visit because her sister had a young baby. And didn't she turn around and say something along the lines of, if anyone is to die here, I'd rather it was me, as my sister's got a baby, or something. I'm probably paraphrasing it.
No, that's pretty much what she's said to have said. And so she's baking bread upstairs in the kitchen, and the Farnsworth house was on the outer edges of the Confederate line. So it's on the outskirts of the town of Gettysburg itself, and a few hundred feet outside town is Cemetery Hill, which is this Union strong point. So Confederates take over the Farnsworth house, which was actually the Sweeney house then. It's called the Farnsworth house now, this big old brick structure. And they begin to fortify it. And up in the attic of the Farnsworth house, they have a good sight line to Cemetery Hill. So the attic is crammed with Confederate soldiers who are trading sniper fire with the Union forces on Cemetery Hill. And it's believed, it's never been proven, and I don't think it can be, although Brad and Barry did a great experiment on Ghost Lab where they used a sniper with a laser beam to prove that you could hit the Jenny Wade house from the Farnsworth house attic. But it's believed that a stray round was fired by a sniper in the Farnsworth house attic, went through the kitchen door, the outer kitchen door, and an inner kitchen door, two doors inside the Jenny Wade house, and hit Jenny Wade in the back. And killed her. And she remains the only official civilian casualty of the battle. Yeah. And if you go to the cemetery at Gettysburg, she is the Stars and Stripes, the American flag, flies above her grave continuously 24/7.
Yeah. I know my parents have visited. I haven't had the honor to visit Gettysburg yet, but I know my parents have. And they did actually say it does feel strange. I think they said they got given a CD with the tour on it, but it wasn't. It flipped out of time, so they lost where they were a bit. So they just drove round and absorbed, and they saw things like the Jenny Wade house. They remember the Jenny Wade house, but they didn't know the full story because the CD had gone out of sync at that point. And they did tell me about a few of the battlefield sites and said that, you know, if you listen to soundtracks of warfare, it makes you realise how almost claustrophobic it would have been to have been involved in it. But when we talk about the sort of, you know, there's no real, in my view, from the reading I've done, and I'd like to know what you think, I don't think there really is. With a lot of battles, you get heroes and villains. I find it hard to put that onto anyone, like those accolades onto anyone in, well, the Civil War in general, but Gettysburg especially. And I know a lot of people paint the Confederates as being the villains because they're meant to represent slavery and the ignorant South and all those kind of things. I would say no. That's not. I don't personally think that's a fair of the soldiers. I don't necessarily mean some of the leaders and stuff. I mean the foot soldiers who were the cannon fodder, for want of a better term. I don't think that's fair to paint them like that. What do you think?
Well, I think that especially now in the current turbulent times in which we all live, we live in an era in which statues and monuments are being torn down. We know that issues of race, especially in the United States, are flaring, and it's a very sensitive time. And everyone has their own opinion on it. My thought about are there any good guys and bad guys in this war? I think that no matter what your opinion is, you cannot deny the courage of those who took part.
Yeah.
You cannot deny that they had the courage of their convictions, and that they endured the most hellish of conditions. Union soldiers would often talk about the fact that, yes, some of them thought they were out to free slaves. Others believed that the great cause was to restore the Union. And, many forget that Abraham Lincoln, and I'm a huge admirer of Lincoln's, but many forget that Lincoln said, if I could restore the Union without freeing the slaves, I would do so.
Yeah.
And so it's such a complex issue. But you just think about all these young men that marched and died far from home for a cause that, whether they believed they were fighting to abolish slavery or whether they believed they were fighting to secure states' rights, they all put their bodies where their mouths were, if you will. They all risked everything, and many of them paid the ultimate price.
Yeah. Yeah. I just say I agree with you with the way things are, and I, if anyone's listening has said that means you condone slavery, I don't at all. But I just think I find it sad that, it's almost like it is almost perceived that the Union guys were the good guys and the Confederates were the bad guys. And the more I research into it and the more history I learn, and I must admit my knowledge of the Civil War is not even 1/100th of what yours is, Richard. But the more I learn about it, the more I do think that respect has to be paid to, like, as you say, all the men who were prepared to take up arms.
You can absolutely despise slavery, as all right-thinking people do, and acknowledge the courage of those that fought on both sides. You can do both.
Yeah.
You don't have to condone slavery in order to appreciate that there were brave men who gave it their all. You can fault their cause by all means, but you can't fault their courage.
Yeah, I agree. Now, one of the brave men, and you actually, in the Farnsworth book, and this is, you're probably going, oh, God's sake, Penny, I spent hours researching, and this is your favourite bit. My favourite bit is the short story at the end. And the short story at the end is about a man, and correct me on any of the bits that are wrong here, Richard, and I can't quite remember where his body was discovered, but it was a Union soldier who died, and nobody knew who he was. His body was discovered, and it was clutching a photo of his wife and three, wasn't it, children? And to try and find out who this brave man was, I think the photo kind of went the equivalent of what we would call now viral.
Yeah, that's fair.
And it transpired he was a chap by the name of Amos Humiston? Yeah, Humston, thank you. And his wife was a lady by the name of Felinda. And I believe they were in New Jersey, New York way, something like that.
Yeah.
And Richard wrote this amazing semi-fiction account of Amos at the back of this book. And if you buy the book for anything, please do read that bit, because it moved me. And I love Richard's work, and him and I talk about history and experiments and things on a pretty regular basis, don't we, when we get to chat?
You do.
But that bit moved me, because it gave, even though it was, like I say, semi-fiction, it gave Amos a voice. It gave Amos a personality. Now, what I found amazing was the plight of Amos's widow, and 3 children caught people's imagination. And so much so, there was actually a song composed called Children of the Battlefield by a man called James G. Clark. And in 1864, I think it was 1864, I'm just checking my notes, yes, 1864, he started selling this song for 25 cents a copy to raise money for Linda and her family, and ostensibly other widowed Civil War wives. So, you know, getting my traditional humour in, Bob Geldof thinks he did all this sort of stuff first. He didn't. But he did. This guy started, and I've read the lyrics. I don't know if you've ever read the lyrics of this song, Richard, but they're pretty emotive. I've never heard the music. I've only read the lyrics. But so he was trying to raise money. But then what actually happened, and this is another place that, again, Richard and I were talking about this off air before we started recording, they actually created an orphanage in Gettysburg for widows and children of Civil War soldiers. And Felinda and her 3 children actually lived there. And Felinda was the first matron of this orphanage, which I think is quite. I wonder if I don't know if I'd want to be where my husband had been killed, but I can kind of see there was no social service, social security back then, was there? So she would have had to rely on the help of family, or would have ended up probably going into the equivalent of the poorhouse back then if she hadn't taken this role. Unfortunately, this orphanage didn't. It was fine when she was running it, but when she left, a lady by the name of
Rosa Carmichael.
Thank you very much. I was just looking for my notes there. Thank you.
And if you're looking for a villain for the Gettysburg story, I think she fits the bill.
You're reading my mind right now, aren't you? Because that's kind of what I was going to allude to. But yes, she wasn't a very nice person, and she was meant to be very, very disciplinarian. But disciplinarian, abusive, potato. She would do things like she would ban the children from partaking in the celebrations, the Civil War celebrations that they'd have every year, or like the victory celebrations, like it's over, commemorations, that kind of thing. She would ban them from talking to people. She would, there's a story of she put a little girl up on a table in a pose she had to be lifted down and have her joints manipulated to get her to be able to move again. And in the end, she did get arrested. And I found a newspaper article about it, that she got given 24 hours to leave Gettysburg and a $20 fine plus court costs.
Which, considering the abuse, and she would have the children chained to the walls in the cellar for hours, if not days. Yeah, she had a pit in the cellar that she'd dug that they could be thrown into, I believe, as well. Yes.
A vile woman. But what I found interesting is there was a similar account of a nurse come matron at a orphanage children's home in the UK around the same time, and she was doing very similar things. She actually got a prison sentence. She got 5 years hard labour. I just find it interesting why Rosa only got a fine.
Yeah, I'm amazed that they did not throw the book at her, and I don't know why they didn't, because I mean, it's nothing less than child abuse. I know the standards of the time were different, but, as if these children had not suffered enough by losing their fathers in the war, or potentially losing both parents sometimes. Yeah. If the mom did not have a means of supporting the children, they often went to an orphanage. It didn't mean that both parents were necessarily dead.
Yep. Exactly. But the parallel I was making was I know of an account, at least one account in the UK at the similar time. I think it was probably 1860s, not 1870s, but it's not that much different. And this nurse was doing similar things to children, and she got 5 years hard labour. So it's something that I thought I'm going to look into more. I'm going to see if I can find the court transcript, because I don't understand why she got such a trivial punishment, in my view. But that's a negative. The idea behind the place was good. Now, what do you think? I mean, we've talked about some of the very famous, Little Round Top, Devil's Den. We talked about Jenny Wade. Most people know about that. Pickets Charge. Most people know about that. Mm-hmm. Which battles do you think that took place at Gettysburg are the least well known, but more people should know about?
Hands down, the Brickyard, which was part of my goal in putting a chapter about the Brickyard in the Farnsworth House haunting, and I had never heard of it until Brad Kling started talking about the Battle of the Brickyard.
Why do you think it should be more well known?
Well, it was a delaying action, but also kind of a last stand. As the Union troops were being borderline routed, certainly falling back in not great order. So through the streets of Gettysburg, trying to regroup on Cemetery Hill, you found these small pockets of resistance that would form, and these miniature engagements. And Coon's Brickyard was kind of one of the great ones in that a Union regiment was basically a speed bump for a force of Confederates that was several times its own size, and they were crushed, as you would expect. But they tried desperately to hold this line to give their comrades a fighting chance at getting away. Mm-hmm. So it took place in this fairly small brickyard, Coon's Brickyard, which is now a beautiful stretch of grass, and it's bordered by several houses. So it's right in the middle of a housing estate. It's the strangest thing. But there is a very colorful long mural, which borders the edge of the brickyard. And it was the scene of intense hand-to-hand fighting, very savage combat. And this is where Amos Hummerston was wounded and ultimately killed in the Battle of the Brickyard. Right.
I mean, there's so many others. Wasn't there a battle actually at Fairfield, where the Fairfield Inn that you've also written about was?
Yeah. But so the reason that nobody ever hears about Fairfield is primarily because it was happening at the same time as Pickets Charge.
Right.
So Pickets Charge on the last day, if you're making a narrative or a movie or whatever, this is the big ending, right? This is where Lee gambles it all on one last throw of the dice and hurls the remnants of his attacking forces against the Union. But outside town, about 8 miles outside town along the Fairfield Road, there's a small town called Fairfield. Mm-hmm. And it turns out that a cavalry battle is going to take place in the region. It's rumored that there is a Confederate wagon train in the area. And of course, one of the principles of war is you always disrupt the enemy's logistics when you can. And cavalry are great at that. Mm. So you have a single Union cavalry regiment that goes in search of this Confederate wagon train. And what they don't realize is they're blundering straight into the path of, again, a much larger Confederate force. Mm-hmm. And so they get mauled pretty badly. Mm-hmm. And so this becomes known as the Battle of Fairfield. And there are a number of suspicions that they were set up and put into an ambush. What's the word I'm looking for? A gentleman walked up to the Union commander and gave him this information free of charge, under very suspicious circumstances. Okay. So they may have been sent to their deaths deliberately. It's not known for sure. Yeah. But once again, you have this outnumbered force that gets destroyed by a much larger one. And the casualties of the Battle of Fairfield, many of them were taken to the Fairfield Inn, which is one of the larger buildings in town and one of the older ones too, where these amputations took place, where they were treated as best the medicine of the time allowed. And a number of them were buried in the area around the inn. Yeah.
Which brings me to my next question. Have you been to any of the sort of the World War I, World War II war graves sites that you can visit?
Do you mean like the military cemeteries where you have row after row of them? Yeah. So I have been to several, yeah.
Okay. Is there a similarity in feeling that you get there to what you get at some of the sites at Gettysburg where you know there were soldiers laid? Do you get what I'm asking? Because I wonder if, having been to a few myself and found it very emotional, seeing just row upon row of, in effect, young man, between the ages of 18 and 35, 40, all of them, all men, all, majority of them dying either on the same day or within a week of each other, or, or that kind of concentration of death. I wonder if it's a similar feeling at some of the more what I'd call sacred areas at Gettysburg.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, perhaps the most moving example I've visited personally I could tell you about is Arlington.
Yeah.
Arlington Cemetery, where you have the dead of all of America's wars and some soldiers that did not die in war but wanted to be buried there with their comrades, you know. JFK, you have the eternal flame.
Yes.
At Arlington that burns for JFK. And one link between that and Gettysburg, which is pretty cool, is that you have the Memorial of Light at Gettysburg, which is an eternal flame that burns on the edge of the battlefield.
Oh, wow.
And there are a number of, you should actually go look up some images of this, Penny, you and your listeners.
Yeah.
We know for a fact that JFK and Jackie visited the memorial because we have pictures of it when they came to Gettysburg. Mm-hmm. And it's believed that when she needed a memorial for her husband after his assassination, the eternal flame that JFK has was influenced by the one she saw at Gettysburg.
Wow, so not only is it a memorial to her husband, it's a memorial to the lost at Gettysburg.
Well, more than it's a memorial to JFK, but it was influenced, its form, the fact that she went with a permanent flame which burns forever was influenced by what she had seen when she visited Gettysburg with her husband.
Wow. I have actually seen JFK's. I must have been to Arlington as well, because I do remember seeing the JFK thing when I was about 7. And I do remember my dad trying in vain to explain to me why it burns and the relevance of it burning constantly, which only a few years later did I really understand the significance of. But that's amazing.
Well, do you know who owned Arlington, the estate, before it became a cemetery?
No, I don't.
Robert E. Lee.
Really?
That was his house. In fact, you can visit, and I did, Lee's house at Arlington. It's left pretty much exactly as it was when he owned it.
I did.
Wow. And if you talk about spite, but one of the reasons that Arlington became the U.S. cemetery for soldiers was that it's rumored anyway, and I apologize that I can't name who said this. I would have to go look up a source for you, but it stuck in my mind from the tour I took there. The tour guide said that we'll fix Bobby Lee. There's no way he'll ever be able to relax in that house again without looking out of the windows at all them dead Union boys that he put in those graves.
Wow. Okay.
And Lee never did return to Arlington. He never did live there again.
Do you know, this is why I love doing my show, Richard, because I learn so much. Not just the research I have to do for every show, but, being able to talk like this and talk around a subject, it's fascinating. Wow. But the thing is, in Gettysburg, there are it's got to be to do with the energy that's been there and what still remains there about the poor souls who fell there that have never got to go home or are still fighting their battles. You've got so many locations. I mean, we've mentioned the orphanage. Another one you mentioned to me that I looked up, and it's a beautiful looking building, so quintessentially sort of Victorian era America, the Cashtown Inn. Which I found that the reason it was called the Cashtown Inn, because it wasn't originally called Cashtown, the place, was because the guy who built it would only accept cash for things. Wouldn't take any form of credit, which I was trying to think, well, what else would there have been in 1797 apart from cash? I suppose you could have put it on the tab.
IOUs.
On the tab sort of thing, but he would only ever accept cash for things, and that was actually a headquarters for the Confederates, I believe, and it's a hospital in the basement. Like every single building had a hospital of some sort. And you told me a fascinating story about the Gettysburg film in relation to the Cashtown Inn.
That's right, and that's where Sam Elliott stayed, and of course the Cashtown Inn is in the movie. Sam Elliott stayed there and apparently adored the Cashtown Inn, adored the atmosphere. And he's been quoted as saying that his work on that film is one of his favorite highlights of his career. He loved the whole experience.
I can imagine.
And the Cashtown, I'd like to do a book about that in future, and it's something I've been speaking with the owner about, actually. But the Cashtown has also quite the haunted reputation. Yeah. Which is not surprising. But it was on one of the main routes, the Cashtown Pike, one of the main advance routes into and out of Gettysburg.
Yeah. Thing is, there's so many. I was just googling places, and you've got like is it the Daniel Lady Farm? You've got Gettysburg Village, Gettysburg Inn, the Hoffman Mansion, Josiah Benner Farmhouse, the Battlefield B&B Inn, Round Top Farm. All these places that all were either hospitals or a place for store. It sounds awful, but for storing the bodies. And you just think the amount of stories that need to be told. I'm not going to say hauntings that are there because I think that trivializes it in a little way, but the amount of people's stories, as you and I were saying off air, when you have a war or a battle, you only ever hear a few of the individual stories. And when you look at the number of men, the fact you had like 170, 180,000 men in total taking part in Gettysburg alone, and you may only hear 2, 3, 4 of those stories.
Well, and often there are highlights because not to throw too much shade, but when you see articles in magazines, especially around about Halloween, we can almost guarantee that you won't be able to log on without seeing an article, top 10 hauntings in Gettysburg and stuff like that. The same stories get regurgitated over and over again. And people that write those articles sometimes like to pick low-hanging fruit. So, they'll talk about Sachs-covered bridge, and they'll talk about Suicide Bridge and things of that nature. But there are all these elements of these small stories within stories that are every bit, if not more, fascinating, and a wider audience really needs to know about them.
Yeah.
Amos Hummerston, I thought, was the poster child for that.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, take for example the photo of the Confederate soldier lying at is it Devil's Den?
The Sharpshooter in Devil's Den.
It's Devil's Den, isn't it? And the fact that he didn't actually die there, he was put there by the photographer to take a shot, or so it's believed.
Yeah, it's an infamous picture, the Sharpshooter. So he didn't die in that spot, but he also wasn't a sharpshooter. And we know this for a fact because the weapon that's propped up against the rock next to him is not a sharpshooter's rifle.
Okay. And
it would not have had the range to hit the Union positions across the way on Little Round Top. So it was 100% staged by the photographer, and for the longest time, was one of it still is one of the iconic pictures of the battle.
Yeah.
But for all the wrong reasons.
Do we know who the poor guy was?
We don't.
No, exactly.
We don't know who this poor kid was.
So that's another story that could be told.
Exactly, and it's been said that people visited the field months afterwards, and his corpse was still there, decomposing. Nobody buried this poor guy. So not only did the kid, because so many of them were young men, right? Yeah. War devours children of all ages. And so this poor young lad not only died far from home, we know this because he was a Confederate, but his body was left to rot, and lies were told about how he died.
Yeah.
It's a mini tragedy, isn't it?
Yeah. So that's my point. That's just, all right, people know his face, but they don't know his name. They don't know the truth. They don't know who his family were back home in wherever he was. I don't know, Tennessee, Florida, Carolinas, who knows?
Alabama, Texas, who knows? Who
knows where he was from? And they don't know if one of his family ever saw that photo and went, but that's, you just don't know. And it's stories like that I find very sad, not quite sad, very sad. The whole sort of the unknown soldier sort of thing that, and the fact that, I don't know about you, but sometimes I find with spirits that the reason they want to talk to people is they want the truth told. They want their name made public so people knew who they were. And I think there's probably so many stories like that from both sides at Gettysburg and possibly other Civil War sites, other battle sites where they want their, and it's up to people like you and me and other people like us to make that known. Which I think is very honoured. I'm very honoured. I'm sure you are as well, Richard, to be given that opportunity and given that ear.
And I agree completely. And it's a real privilege just to go to Gettysburg. And I find it encouraging that your parents have been. I would encourage every American to visit at some point in their life, to make the equivalent of a pilgrimage, because the entire country, the history of the country turned at that place. It's such a pivotal moment, but it's also, it truly is hallowed ground. It truly is. And to appreciate what those men on both sides suffered, I think is essential. You know, it gives one an appreciation for why the world is the way it is today. And as we've seen in the news this year, the Civil War, it still reverberates throughout American history. The issues, or some of the issues that were fought over, were still plainly not resolved. And they continue to plague us to this day.
Well, it's over an hour we've been chatting, with quite easily as well. I think we probably could have doubled this up, talking about the various things in Gettysburg. So we've talked about the books you've had out this year. What's next? Which book is next, and when can we expect it?
So I'm finishing my my book about the haunting of the Monroe House in Indiana, Hartford City, Indiana. That will be next. I was hoping to have that out for Halloween, but things have gotten busy along various other fronts. So now I'm thinking it will be released in November, and that will probably be my last book of the year. Okay. It's called On Dark Ground. The Monroe House is very much a dark and convoluted story. And I've interviewed a number of people that have had strange experiences there. So we'll have to talk about that one, I think, on a later show. But that's what's next from me. Okay. Well, obviously you've not been able to make your normal excursion to the UK this year because of the virus and safety and everything else, which I understand, especially taking into account your day job. But, you know, I'm sure we'll catch up again next year when things get more safe and well, less dangerous. As you know, I was supposed to be coming to Canada this year and had to well, that sadly as well. So it's been one of those years, but I think I'm hoping we'll have all learned some valuable lessons from this year of the fact. Well, you know, Penny, I would love to see you when it's safe to travel again. I would actually love to see you come to Gettysburg and do the Gettysburg Battlefield Bash as a speaker. Whoever organises that, tell them. I'll actually do that right now. Pam and Steve Barry, Pam and her husband Steve run the bash themselves. Eric Julian, a good friend of mine, is also involved with that, and many volunteers. I'd love to see you come out there and speak at that, because you know a great deal about military history and the paranormal aspects of it. So be great to see you do that. That's sponsored through the Gettysburg Ghost Exchange, and we should talk a little bit offline. Okay, I'd love to. And see about the possibility of doing that. Hey, you know me, I like to talk, and if I get to talk about history and ghosts, especially military history and ghosts, say military history or workhouses and ghosts, I'm there. And I think next time when my book on Fort Mifflin comes out, you and I should definitely do a show on that too, and talk about Revolutionary War ghosts. Wow. You really like doing my research, don't you? Because you pick subjects that my knowledge is about on. Well, to be fair, so was mine. But when someone offers you, an Englishman no less, the keys to a Revolutionary War era fort, you don't say no. There is that. I do remember, actually. I don't know which of the brothers it was that said this in your book, but was talking to you. I think it was the Fairfield book. I might be wrong. It might be Farnsworth. But yeah, you could have picked two books that didn't have the same first letter for the venues, because it's very confusing to us blondes. But didn't they say something about the fact it was less than 80 years before we were fighting with each other again? Yeah. Absolutely, it's crazy, isn't it? The way history goes. Yeah. So, So the revolution would be the Revolutionary War would be the next logical one for me to learn about, because I do hate to admit it, but I used to get the two a bit muddled up before I started. I think it's one that I didn't know much about either, and it's a fascinating period of history, looking at it from both sides. You know, looking at the British angle. When I went to Fort Mifflin, I was just taken by how these poor British boys died so far from home. Yeah. You know, and they really didn't have a cause other than king and country. You know, they were told, go and go fight in the colonies.
Yeah.
And a lot of them, again, paid with their lives. So I felt a lot of kinship for those poor lads when I went to Fort Mifflin.
You know how we could introduce the show, though?
How?
The British really are coming.
Yeah, there you go. Problem is, the dirty jokes write themselves.
Yes, they do when you and I are talking to each other, Mr. Estep. They definitely do.
Yeah.
Anyway,
it's like ghost hunting with Sid James.
Yeah, and then you get Wes into the mix as well. And yeah, it's who can come out with the worst one-liner, I think. But on that note, thank you ever so much for being my guest. It's been a pleasure as always. Do keep us posted with the books, and obviously when you're next going to be in the UK, because I'll probably have about 4 then that need signing.
Yeah, no worries at all. I hope it's going to be next summer or late spring.
Cool. And my new one should be out by then as well. So we'll be able to have a sign-off session.
There you go.
There you go. Well, on that note, that has been the wonderful Mr. Richard Estep, my good friend and fellow author. And he probably doesn't realise I said this in an interview recently, one of the reasons I am an author. I did, he was one of the people who encouraged me to do the writing in the first place, and he has been one of the original Haunted Histories guests from nearly 4 years ago, and he still keeps coming back. He must like it. He must be a glutton for punishment. Well, on that note, I hope you've enjoyed listening to Haunted Histories exclusively on Paranormal UK Radio. I will be back in a couple of weeks with another amazing guest talking history and mystery. If you've missed any of the shows, you can go and catch up on them either on the Paranormal UK Radio website, or if you go over to the hauntedhistories.co.uk website, they're all on there, and they're on Spotify and all the various podcast links that you can listen to. So I'm going to bid you all, if I could get my words out anyway, and I'm going to bid you all a very fond farewell. So have a good evening, sleep tight, and don't worry too much about things that go bump in the night.